Now it's time, and it will be done. That's the latest in a string of threats from President Trump claiming Greenland for the US. As far as the White House is concerned, it's only a matter of time. NATO and EU allies think differently. But can they really stop a determined Donald Trump? It's up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nusafora. In a recent interview, the UN Secretary General said some countries, including the US, think the power of law should be replaced by the law of power. And when it comes to Greenland, that seems to be exactly what the US is arguing.
If there were an attack on Greenland from Russia, from some other area, we would get dragged in. So better now, peace through strength, make it part of the United States, and there will not be a conflict because the United States right now, we are the hottest country in the world, we are the strongest country in the world.
So, in other words, hand it over peacefully and no one gets hurt. The first blunt instrument the US intends to deploy is a 10% tariff on every European ally to stand in its way. In a revival of last year's trade wars, the EU is now considering reciprocation, and France's president even wants to activate a so-called trade bazooka against his NATO ally.
Germany and France are in agreement. We will not allow ourselves to be blackmailed. Europe will give a united, clear response, and we're now preparing united countermeasures with our European partners.
Tough talk aside, though, can European leaders really stop him? Especially when it appears President Trump has a Nobel Peace Prize-shaped axe to grind. In a message to the Norwegian Prime Minister, he said after failing to win the prize, he no longer feels the need to think purely for peace. Coming up, we'll debate if the annexation of Greenland is inevitable. What can Europe really do to stop it? And has the Transatlantic alliance been irreparably damaged? Joining us for this debate is Jonathan Shaw, a former head of the UK's Special Forces and a former Assistant Chief of Defence Staff for International Security Policy. Will Chamberlain is joining us, Senior Counsel at the Article 3 Project and the Internet Accountability Project. And rounding out our panel is Stephen Jensen, former Norwegian Army officer who served alongside American troops, both in Afghanistan and in Africa, and currently works as a strategy consultant and writer focusing on war and geopolitics. Welcome to all of you here on Counterpoints. Well, over the weekend, US President Donald Trump didn't just double down on his threat to annex Greenland, he's also warned European countries not to try to stop him. He says he'll impose a 10% tariff on any country that attempts to prevent the US takeover. He wrote on social media, "Now it is time and it will be done." So Will, let's start with you. Will President Trump get his way? Is the annexation of Greenland inevitable?
I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but I think it's the likely outcome. I think that the likely outcome is that, eventually I think the European nations will realize that there is a price at which it makes sense to sell Greenland to the United States and sell the rights to Greenland. America being the dominant figure in the security umbrella, I think means that, we're footing the bill for an enormous amount of European and transatlantic security. Greenland's very close to us. Greenland is right in between us and my understanding. You guys might have better understanding given your more significant military experience, but it's right in between where, Russia stages its naval forces and a lot of its missile capabilities. And so if you actually look over the globe, that's Greenland's right in between that. So our presence in Greenland is really important. And also, I think, Greenland's making a lot of noises about wanting independence for the 50,000 people who live there to control the entire island and then be in a position to potentially make deals with either China or Russia. And there was a major fight over that, I think, back 5 or 6 years ago, where a Chinese company was coming in, attempting to build major infrastructure projects in Greenland. They've done this in other places too, where they basically allow these countries to invest in these infrastructure projects on spec, and then when they can't meet the payments, the Chinese state-owned companies just take over ownership of the infrastructure projects, which would be a huge problem for the United States. Thankfully, Denmark at that time put a stop to it. But the fact is, I don't know that Denmark's even going to be able to stop Greenland from becoming independent of itself. And then we're reliant on the whims of 50,000 people in Greenland to dictate the security situation for 300 million people in the United States. I don't think that's really tenable for us. I think there's a lot of, and that's before we get to any of the economic reasons why investment in Greenland makes a lot more sense if we're in actual ownership of it. So I think what I would urge the Europeans to do is to actually come to the table with a price, right? And if you think that price needs to be really, really high, then say that price needs to be really, really high. But at the same time, understanding that, I'm not in President Trump's head. I don't have a full picture of what he understands about Greenland's importance to national security concerns, but I got to think it's really serious given the amount of money he's suggesting he's willing to pay for it. So I think that's the best outcome.
All right. Jonathan, what do you make of that? Will sort of was, deferring to both you and Stephen with your security background. Put your security, military sort of hat on for us. Is this an inevitable military exercise? Is there a price that Greenland should be willing to accept to become part of the United States?
Okay, so take a rather different view. In 1951, the United States and Denmark came to an agreement which basically gave the United States total freedom to put whatever defense resources they wanted into Greenland, recognizing the threat in the Cold War. And indeed, there were quite a lot. There were thousands of American troops in Greenland at that time. What we've seen since 1951 is a steady reduction of United States forces in Greenland, to the extent now that, as my understanding is, there is only one base left that has any Americans on it. So if you're looking for who is responsible for the security of Greenland, it should be it has traditionally been the Americans. And if you're looking for why those resources have gone down, it's because the Americans have pulled them out. So if Greenland is vulnerable, it's because the Americans have pulled their forces out. So they can easily solve that under the terms of the 1951 agreement by putting their troops back in there accordingly to their threat assessment. Now, if you ignore that and if you accept the logic of what Donald Trump is saying, that they need to own the country, which I dispute, because they can do everything they want from a security point of view. They're already allowed to do it. But if you accept the principle that they need to own it, then, as you said at the start there is this thing called the GIUK gap, which is the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, through which the Russian nuclear fleet would sail. And if you're concerned about American security, you want to secure the GIUK gap. Now, if you do that through NATO, that's fine. It's as the situation is now. But if you don't believe that the current levels of access are good enough, which is what Trump is just saying and what you, Will, were just arguing, as far as I understand it, then in which case Trump's next move will be to take Iceland, and it'll be to take Scotland. And let's face it, he owns so many golf courses in Scotland, he might as well buy Scotland lock, stock and barrel. And who knows?
Would the English be really that upset if that happened? I don't know that the English would be all that upset if that actually happened.
I'd be very upset, actually, but there we go. So you see, there is a lack of principle here. It seems to me that Donald Trump can already achieve everything he wants to achieve from a security point of view under existing agreements. And if that is not good enough for him, then unfortunately that imperial prejudice, that imperial logic that he is articulating extends far wider than just Greenland and puts even the United Kingdom under threat.
I'm going to absolutely come back to that future threat, perhaps, that you raised there, Jonathan, about Iceland, Scotland next. I'm going to come to that a bit later in the debate, so I'm going to put a pin in that and turn over to you, Stephen. What do you make of that? I mean, the argument also that Will was putting forward that a very small population of Greenland could have a say in the population of the US if it's to be dragged into a conflict to protect Greenland. So is there something to be said for maybe peace through strength, as the White House likes to say?
Well, I think we Europeans as Americans believe in self-determination and sovereignty. The Greenlanders have had long discussions with Denmark about what the status of Greenland should be. They've decided that they want to have a degree of autonomy, but still is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. One of the good reasons for that is that Denmark is part of NATO, which brings us back to Jonathan's previous point. It's not just the case that the US has full access to Greenland, but it's also the case that the NATO treaty means that the US, as every other member of NATO, is currently obligated to defend every inch of Greenland as if it was their own territory. This is the core principle of NATO. It's an attack on one country, it's an attack on every other country. So, Norway, UK, Finland, Denmark, doesn't matter. All of us have a commitment to defend Greenland. Now, so if the Americans now are saying, well, actually, if we really want to defend it, we have to annex it first, then what they're also saying is, well, why should we then believe that they would defend or come to our aid and honor the treaty if Finnmark is under threat, or Scotland, or Iceland, or
Stephen,
any other
we did hear
of,
the US
of
Treasury
NATO.
Secretary saying that if NATO is forced to intervene in Greenland, though, that the US is going to be dragged into an unnecessary conflict. So is it not better maybe that Greenland is part of the US and we can avoid that conflict altogether?
No, I think that's completely turning it upside down. The reason why NATO is a strong deterrent is that if you go to war with NATO, you go to war with every country in NATO. Now, the United States is by far and away the strongest individual country in NATO, but it only makes up about 2/3 of the total capabilities, depending on if you count it by dollars. And the European share is growing very, very rapidly. Europe is spending about twice as much as it did in 2014. By breaking the alliance, which would be the unambiguous result of annexing Greenland, you're making an attempt on either Greenland or on other parts of Europe much, much, much more likely. And as Jonathan pointed out, if you want to control the North Atlantic, you not only have to control Greenland, you also have to control Scotland, you also have to control Iceland. If you want to control what's east of Iceland, you also have to control northern Norway. So if you're breaking your alliance with the countries controlling those areas, either you lose control of the North Atlantic or you have to invade everyone. It's an incredibly bad idea for both the US and for Europe to end NATO. It's an incredibly bad idea, which makes war far, far, far more likely.
We're going to come to NATO and to European alliances in our next chapter. So I'll get a hold on that and we'll come back to it because, Will, I want to bring you back in. Jonathan was sort of intimating there this idea of an imperial logic to sort of Trump's thinking here. I mean, do you see some credence in the critique of the president behaving as a bit of an imperialist over, military alliances?
I mean, it's part of the American tradition. I mean, it's part of American history. I mean, we bought Alaska from Russia. We bought the Virgin Islands in 1925
Yeah, but not every
Denmark.
country is eager to repeat their history. Have we not learned anything from imperial histories of the past?
I mean, is the analogy here to, that we're going to enslave the Greenlanders or something? I mean, I don't think that strikes me as the most unlikely scenario of various scenarios here.
Maybe enslave their natural resources. Is this really about security?
But But I mean, I think it's all of the above, right? I mean, America does need to secure rare earth minerals. That's very important for American military security. And again, not just America, but NATO as well. And I mean, we had the Greenlanders themselves basically thwarted a uranium mining project on the island. I think that was a big thing. And there's only, I think, 2 active mining projects in Greenland. That was my understanding, or maybe that information is out of date. But the mine in Greenland is massively undermined, and it's the 50,000 people who live in Nuuk who are saying, no, we don't want it mining anywhere on the island. All of this stuff is sort of coming back to the question of, is because Denmark is kind of willing to give more and more autonomy to the 50,000 Greenlanders over this entire massive island that is very, very crucial to American security, and also the economics of which are very important to America. Like, can we just allow a world in which those 50,000 Greenlanders suddenly do a deal with China? So I think that to me strikes me as like the big overarching problem here that President Trump is probably trying to solve, although it's hard to get inside his mind because we don't know what the information he's looking at is. But I do have to say that I don't think, even in a world where we bought Greenland in the same way that we bought Alaska, I don't think that means we're going to invade Iceland or, God forbid, invade Scotland. I don't want to, that would be a very bizarre Braveheart Part 2, William Wallace throwing the Americans off of the beaches at Orkney or something.
What about the idea that this is unpopular with America? Oh, sorry, Jonathan. Yeah, you go ahead, and I'll put something back to Will after you've said your piece.
So it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, the trouble is with Trump's nakedly imperial ambitions is that it is already forcing people who should be natural allies of the United States to do deals with the Chinese, which can only be bad for the United States. Take Canada, for instance, who, let's face it, are much more dominant to the United States security than Greenland, and as Trump has said, is on his shopping list. Well, the reality is that what Mark Carney is doing is reducing the amount of dependence of Canada on American trade down to aiming below 50%, and is now doing deals with China, which must be making the American administration really disappointed and angry. So, already we're seeing that that Trump's behavior is achieving exactly what he claims to be trying to resist. So it's counterproductive.
All right, Will, respond to that.
No, I think there's actually some truth to that, honestly. Like, I think that I'm worried about what's going on in England. I'd like to see, probably not, I don't know that you'd agree with me on this, but I'm a big fan of Nigel Farage personally. I'd like to see him win. I don't think antagonizing the Brits and sort of creating problems for Farage where he has to distance himself from a long-term ally is great for him. So I think there's actually genuine truth to that. And I don't know that the administration has fully weighed the downsides of kind of what that does to the domestic political situation in other countries. So, that said, again, it's one of those situations where, Trump might have considered that or Trump might have just ignored it. I don't know. But I think that's a legitimately good argument against what President Trump is doing. But
all right. Well, I said I wanted to circle back to something Stephen was talking about earlier with regards to NATO and Europe. So let's move on to the second segment of our debate and look at alliances, because not surprisingly, we've heard some stern words out of Europe, but as yet, not a great deal of action. The UK Prime Minister was somewhat restrained, saying that calm dialogue and diplomacy was needed, whereas France and Germany were somewhat tougher, accusing the US of blackmail and threatening retaliatory tariffs. Stephen, in reality, do you think Europe can stop the US president? Are retaliatory tariffs enough to deter Donald J. Trump?
I think I'm even less capable than Will of getting into Mr. Trump's head. But I think the key thing here is not whether the US can take Greenland if it wants to do that by military means ultimately. The question is, what would be the consequence of that? The unambiguous consequence of using military means to take Greenland would be the end of the NATO alliance. which would be, for the reasons we discussed, an incredibly bad idea, both for the United States, even if it would hurt Europe even more. Perhaps it would, perhaps it wouldn't. I think on the way to that, there's obviously lots of other steps in the escalation ladder, whether that is retaliatory tariffs or other things. I think just because the European leaders have been a little bit more circumspect about how to speak about this and have approached it with a bit less bluster, doesn't mean that this isn't taken extremely seriously. And I think the most important way in which it's taken seriously is, until now, the understanding of most of the European leaders is that Trump isn't a huge fan of NATO, but understands that this is important, and this is not something he wants to break. At this point, I think that assumption has come seriously under question, because if the Americans are saying we actually don't want to, or
well, we seem to have had a slight issue with Stephen's audio and video there. So we'll look into that and come back to him. We'll pick up on what Stephen has been saying, though. Do you think that there is anything Europe can do that can deter President Trump if he decides that he wants to go ahead with this?
I mean, they can deter him from using military force, but I don't think that's what he wants to do. The one thing I'm confident about the Trump playbook is he likes to make big demands and big threats and be seen as kind of crazy. And then, I mean, he's written about this in his books a million times, where he just makes some obscene first request or first demand to kind of set the anchor pretty far out. I'm pretty confident that President Trump just wants to buy it, that's what he wants.
Do you think that Europe can do anything to prevent that from happening? Is what I'm asking, I guess, can you visualize a world where Europe is going to stand up against the US?
I don't think they have the stomach for it. I think, and I guess the evidence of that is in the recent tariff deal, where, I mean, there was a lot of talk about retaliation, and Canada was willing to retaliate, but the European countries in the EU, even with the combined powers of the bloc, still settled for a 15% tariff and 15% tariff on the goods they sell to the United States, and zero incoming tariff on American goods, which is just a dramatic reversal of decades of economic policy between the United States and Europe. So, and I think that at the end of the day, I mean, what Mr. Jensen said, we're 2/3 of the combined military capability, and you're getting all the European countries to agree on anything is an enormous challenge. Like, a lot of those European countries aren't going to be down with extremely confrontational tactics vis-a-vis the United States. So they're just going to have much more trouble resisting the United States. And also, eventually, there's just a number that makes too much sense, both for the Danes, for the Greenlanders, for everybody. I think that's sort of, people aren't, how much money is the United States willing to pay for Greenland? A lot, I think, under President Trump. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a number that, especially you can either take this huge sum of money and lose your rights to Greenland, or you can pay huge amounts of tariffs and deal with the job losses that result from that. I think that there will be a number that makes sense.
Do you think that that's the reality, Jonathan? Does Europe not have the stomach, as Will says, to go up against President Trump?
Well, I think we all keep waiting for Europe to discover the fighting spirit that seems to be curiously absent at the moment. And that is because we've been dependent on the United States for so long. We've taken them for granted, and the dreadful peace dividend that we've been seeing since the Cold War ended. And boy, we've seen that dramatically in Britain, where defense spending fell from, back in 1982, I remember when we fought the Falklands War, our defense expenditure was over 4% of gross domestic product, and now it's somewhere hovering around 2%. And it's pathetic. And if you take the Americans out of the equation, we need to ramp up our defense spending way more than we used to be, because we need to fill the void left by the United States, who now everyone regards as an unreliable part of the team. But one thing we haven't mentioned is the fact that there is a major vulnerability in the United States that the United States has vis-a-vis Europe, and that is that Europe owns so much of the U.S. Treasury debt. And, people are saying that we could simply bring the United States to a halt by slamming up interest rates or just refusing to hold the Treasury bonds. So you talk about, Will talks about the United States being prepared to pay any price for Greenland. The question is that America is so much in debt already. Where's it going to get that money from? The money markets. Well, perhaps Europe isn't going to buy the debt anymore. Once you stop buying American debt, America gets bust very, very quickly. And so it's a vulnerability that people talk about. Now, it would take some courageous move by Europe to do that. And given we didn't have the courage to didn't even have the courage to take the Russian money that is locked in a Belgian vault to buy out the Ukrainians. It seems unlikely. But nonetheless, it is a vulnerability. And if Trump keeps banging on about being imperial vis-a-vis Europe, then sooner or later the worm will turn and Europe will bite back.
Will they bite back, Will? I mean, can you see that sort of reality where they just freeze the markets?
Well, I feel like maybe we're now in a world where I have a little bit more confidence than my guest, which is normally not how the rest of this discussion has felt, given that we've been discussing special forces and military issues. But we're suddenly in the world of economics, and I'm like, aha,
hit us,
I
Will.
studied that in my undergraduate degree. But the point being, there's a famous American philanthropist, wealthy guy by the name of John Paul Getty, and he had a great anecdote. He said, if you owe the bank $1 million, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And I think that when it comes to sovereign debt, the consequences of trying to do some sort of run on sovereign debt by either Europe or China, as has been often threatened, is actually would be quite suicidal. And that's one point in response to that. The other point is, I think sovereign debt doesn't quite work the same way. And I think this confusion it comes to bear in all sorts of different policy contexts. Sovereign debt is not the same as individual household debt, and especially sovereign debt of the world's superpower is not the same as individual bank debt. The United States is still, the country protected by the strongest military in the world, and it's, able to collect taxes from 300 million of the wealthiest people in the world. We have run the table on big technology. I mean, there was that graph that showed that the European Union is collecting more money in fines from American tech companies than it is in taxes from its domestic tech companies. That's not a good position for Europe to be in if it tries to get in some sort of economic war with the United States. It's just not. I think what much of this entire debate is actually sort of, basically Donald Trump holding up the mirror to Europe and saying, look at yourself. You're not capable of defending Greenland. You're not capable of defending your own economies. You're not capable of defending yourselves militarily. Like, wake up. And if you actually look at the national security strategy that we wrote, it's us screaming, like, get control of your countries, right? Get control of your borders and build up your countries to the greatness of their past. I come from English stock. Like, I'd love to see the United Kingdom be, return a little bit to sort of its former glory. And I just, I hate to be weirdly arrogant and be like, you guys are weak, but I feel like that's a little bit what Trump is doing. He's holding up the mirror and saying, come on, guys.
Jonathan?
He's got a point. Oh, no, he's right. I mean, I've been banging on about it. I mean, we recently published a strategic defense review, which was actually a very good document analyzing the threats we faced in the world. It came before Trump became officially classified as a threat to the United Kingdom. But there you go. It's a good paper, the SDR. And in it, Britain declared, or the Prime Minister signed up to the fact that we needed to accept that basically we were at war. And therefore, we needed to prioritize that in government spending. And since publishing that document, he's done absolutely nothing about it, which rather comes back to the point that we're good at signing papers and making words, but not that good at actually doing anything about it. So I'm afraid, Will, I agree with you.
We still are having trouble reconnecting with our third guest, Stephen Jensen, so we will continue into the third phase of our debate with the two of you gentlemen. If we can get Stephen back, we will. This isn't the first time we've seen significant tensions between the US and its European allies. I mean, they've weathered the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. Germany and France were vocally opposed to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Allies don't always need to agree, but is this something different? Jonathan, has the trust in the US-EU relationship been irreparably broken?
Well, I don't know about irreparably, but it has certainly been damaged. The problem is that the United States government has always felt that the European Union has been a bit of a challenge. It has the same population, it has roughly the same gross money, theoretically, and so it can't be bullied around in the way that individual nations can. So, there's a lot of support in the United States for seeing the European Union not exist anymore. It's the same argument as Russia. You can pick off individual countries, whereas together we're much stronger. Now, as a keen Remainer, I was actually appalled that we voted for Brexit, because I think that was a real own goal. One of the bases of the Brexit decision was to rely more on the United States, which is what a lot of the Brexiteers wanted. And that choice is now looking rather ironic, given that it's the United States that is seen very much as a disruptor and not a reliable partner. So in terms of trust, yes, I think the actions of Donald Trump are causing severe breaches of trust. So yes, it's very damaged. Can it come back again? I don't know. We'll see. I would never say never, but I think it's not looking good at the moment.
Will, do you think that this is damaged? Is the US not a reliable partner and would prefer to see a weak EU?
I'll answer those questions in turn. We're certainly not going to be taken for granted anymore, right? I think that Chris Landau, who's Deputy Secretary of State, had a very good ex-post where he described in his discussions with his European colleagues how when they put on their NATO hat, they're extremely solicitous of the Americans, they're grateful to the Transatlantic Alliance, et cetera, et cetera. And then when they take off their NATO hat and they put on their EU hat, all of a sudden it's extraordinarily adversarial in terms of their negotiating vis-a-vis the United States. I think that a good example of this would have been the European Commission's levying $120 million fine on Elon Musk. I think that was pretty offensive to the United States. Elon Musk is a very good friend of the administration, and so we found that quite frustrating. And then, the statistic I talked about earlier, where you're levying more in fines from American tech companies than you're collecting in taxes from your own. These seem the sort of interesting ways of taxing the alliance that we're already bearing the primary burden of. At least American taxpayers are vis-a-vis military spending. So I think that's the answer to your first question. I think that you can say reliable partner is another way of saying partner not really happy about being taken for granted anymore and wants a rebalancing of the restructuring of our relationship to be what in our view fair. What was I forget what your second point was.
Does the US not want a strong EU? Jonathan was sort of saying that, it's a strong collective can stand up to the US, weaker individual countries not so much.
So I think that we don't, to be fair, I think it's pretty clear we don't like the EU as an institution in the way, again, it's sort of this economic bloc trying to negotiate against our interests. And I think it's jarring when we're dealing with that tension between how the European Union countries interact with us when they're talking about NATO and military cooperation versus when they're talking about economics. So I think but at the same time, we do want the European countries to be stronger internally. I think, and I also think, one of the things I would say to the Remainer UK types is that what's happening is that your population is screaming at you over immigration. And I think that there just somehow there needs to be a reorientation of things in a lot of these Western European countries that you're going to have these right-wing rebellions effectively against the EU and the global governance if the EU is this super incredible force for migration into your countries. And I think you'd have a lot more buy-in to the European Union generally and wouldn't have to worry about people like Farage if you were solving your immigration problems.
Jonathan, is there anything you want to say on that?
You're going down a completely different line here, which is interesting. Okay, so if you're on the Brexit debate was actually the idea that Brexit would somehow solve our migration problem was one of the greatest cons ever sold to the British population. More people have come into Britain from outside the EU than inside. Always, throughout history.
I understand that.
And I just wanted to give Jonathan a right of reply on that. We're not going to now get into a full immigration debate, but I just wanted to make sure we balance the ledger on that. Jonathan, bring us back, though, to Greenland, because Will was saying that when the NATO hats are on, we're all friendly. When the EU hats are on, not so much. Is this the most serious crisis, though, of the NATO alliance since its inception? We've had the Danish Prime Minister saying this could be the end of NATO. Could it be the end of NATO?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, of course. It is existential. It's the only time we've ever had a threat of one country against another. And I agree with Will that I don't think that Trump wants to attack, and I don't think he will launch a military raid on Greenland. It is part of his negotiating tactic. The trouble is that words are words, and people remember the words. And the fact that you can say things that are so deeply imperialist and against the whole political concept on which Western Europe is built. You think, well, if he's prepared to say that, what is he prepared to do? And that's, as I say, this is part of the Trump scare tactics. The trouble is it has true resonance and people take it seriously. We are still learning to take Donald Trump very seriously in what he says. And indeed, he wants to be taken very seriously. Well, if you take his imperial statements very seriously, then you end up thinking, right, he's not part of our club anymore because we don't believe what he believes. And he's not a reliable partner. And, if we allow him to take Greenland, he could take Iceland and Britain next, as I've said. So the damage he is causing internally to NATO is huge. Having said that, he's doing us a favor in the sense that he is making all of us, the non-American parts of NATO, invest more in NATO. And that's a good thing. So I'm with him on that. Mm-hmm.
Will, what do you think about the destabilising internal elements?
I mean, I think I said before that that's a downside that I don't know that Trump has fully incorporated into his analysis, right? I think that that's one of the best arguments against what Trump is doing with this sort of bullying foreign policy is that you're actually empowering left-wing populist movements in the countries that you're targeting to kind of oppose Trump. And then that means that we probably have less good relationships going forward. And I think Canada is actually a really good example of that, right? Like Pierre Poilievre was going to win that election probably until Trump started saying mean things and talking about Canada as the 51st state, which is funny as I found it. The Canadians apparently do not share my sense of humor nor Trump's. So, that's, I think, a very good argument against what Trump is doing. And I think that I don't know that it counsels in the other direction. That said, I'm sort of reluctant, especially with foreign policy. You'll find that I generally am in the position where I generally defer to the president on most of these questions. And the reason being that historically I've trusted his judgment. From the American perspective, he's done a lot of things and a lot of his interventions have worked extremely well, even when people have challenged him on them. I think the Iranian intervention was a good example of that. Who even knew that we had the capability to literally capture the Venezuelan president, kidnap him and bring him back to New York City without taking a single American casualty or a single loss of any sort of military equipment. So, and that was kind of in opposition to the sort of natural reflexes of the Trump base, which is largely anti-interventionist, anti-regime change, that sort of thing. And yet, and Trump himself has historically not been favorable to those things, a notable critic of the Iraq War, for instance. And yet he's in the position where he's like, no, we can do these things and they're going to work. And when he's said that, he's been able to do them and they have worked. So with regard to Greenland, if his judgment is, go ahead.
Can I ask Will a question? How disruptive are these policies causing to Trump's base in America? Because I've just been reading, there's a guy called Dan Bacon, who's a GOP representative. He calls this policy a foolish policy, sounds like Putin. You've got a Senator Thomas Tillis, I think his name is, saying this is bad for America, it's good for Xi and Putin, and he doesn't blame Trump. He blames the stupid advisors, people like Stephen Miller and people. Is this causing a schism within the Republican Party, and is it politically sustainable domestically?
The answer to your question is not really. And the reason I'd say that is both Don Bacon and Tom Tillis are retiring. And so they're willing to say these things. You'll notice that among the legislators who are planning to try and keep their seats, they are not saying a thing. And this is
But there has been a
consistently
Reuters
true.
Ipsos poll that came out, Will, that found only 17% of Americans across the board think that this is a good idea.
Right, but then if you look at, I mean, look at what is the current approval of President Trump among Republican voters, 90%. So the people who voted for Trump are 90% of them are still happy with him. If he's lost a modest amount, he's lost the people who only pulled the lever for him reluctantly. This is not a case where he's betraying. And I think part of it is he's not betraying the core promise he made. Like in a sense, the core promise he made is to go back to the very beginning of the conversation, an imperialist one, make America great again. Right, make America the dominant world power on the global stage. So when he does things that are sort of audacious and arrogant and globe strutting, if you will, he's not going to alienate the Republican base in America. That's just not going to happen. He's going to, when you talk about Bacon and Tillis, those are sort of, we would call those guys moderates and squishes, maybe the the wet Tories, if you will, of the Republican Party. So I think that's not a great way those are not the best indicators of a real divide in the party.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Jonathan, what do you think of the argument that Europe needs an army then? Does Europe need its own army if it's going to stand up to the might of a strong America?
Well, if you're looking at how to reorganize NATO without the United States, it is going to take some formidable eating of humble pie by various countries, and it's going to cause great difficulties. It was always one of the reasons touted, I thought incorrectly, about Brexit. One of the reasons for getting out of the EU, touted by the Brexiteers, was precisely to avoid our army coming under European control. I've always thought that was a false fear. But I think now we need to look very seriously at how we'd organize it. And you're absolutely right to stress at the start that the command and control, who is in charge of these forces and who gives them the decisions to go to war, is a tough one. At the moment, we all accept NATO. We all accept basically American command and control. And we have been very good at creating, in places like Kosovo and in other places, particularly the Balkans, though, organizations that have worked without the Americans. So it is possible, but it'll take a large political, as I say, humble pie, because a country's military is the extreme embodiment of the national will. And so to put them under the EU when we're not even a member of the EU is tricky. So I think some other structure may need to be looked for. Mm-hmm. Because if you get the people like Norwegians in there as well, and Canada, these are not countries that are part of the EU, but they do need to be part of some sort of entity. And how we create that, well, let's see. But I think something like that's going to need to be done.
We're almost out of time, so let me just do one rapid-fire question to each of you very briefly to round us out. How will this end? How does this play out?
I think this ends with the Americans buying Greenland. I think that's what it does for a very high number, but I think that's that's the outcome that makes the most sense for all parties involved, is we end up buying Greenland, paying a very high price for it.
Jonathan, how does it play out?
I hate to say, I mean, that is the logical line. You can see the way that's going to run. But on the other hand, I wouldn't put money on it. But I can't tell you what I can think otherwise. Maybe I'm just wishful thinking. But I just hope it doesn't happen, because I think it sets a dreadful precedent. And I think it's very dangerous for European stability and global stability, actually.
It will be very interesting.
I think there's more to life than money.
Well, maybe that's a whole separate debate, Jonathan. We might have to get both of you back on to see how this does play out. It's going to be Interesting times ahead indeed. We appreciate your contribution. Jonathan Shaw, former head of the UK Special Forces, Will Chamberlain, senior counsel at the Article 3 project, and joining us earlier before we lost his connection, Stephen Jensen, former Norwegian Army officer who served alongside American troops. We appreciate his contribution and, of course, both of yours. Thanks for being here on Counterpoints. And to you, our viewers, as always, thanks for tuning in to this episode. To keep up to date with our latest debates and interviews, be sure to subscribe to Al Arabiya English on YouTube and follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you for the next debate.